As the previous video installation within this series had laid out the general conditions and circumstances involved in the combat operations that were now unfolding within the southwest of the city of Fort Worth by 3:15 a.m. on October the 4th, or day one of the invasion, the two pursuing battalions from the PLA, one light mechanized infantry battalion of the 24th Light Infantry Brigade of the PLA's Ready Reserve 59th Group Army, as well as also an armored battalion from the 59th PLA Group Army's 35th Armored Brigade, both of which being effectively the very same battalions that had initially assaulted other forces of the 1st of the 124th Cav Squadron, effectively a battalion in Cav terms, who were tasked with defending the Naval Air Station in White Settlement within the greater Fort Worth area, as these very same two battalions had taken a 1-hour logistical resupply period to top off their fuel, ammunition, and other logistical requirements before pursuing, cutting off, and surrounding the remaining two companies, which were the last two surviving combat companies and last two companies in more general terms of the 1st of the 124th in the southwest of Fort Worth. The ability to do so was effectively predicated on the fact that the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion, a wheel-based force, was a highly mobile and rapidly moving force, and also the fact that due to a complete and total lack of communications and ISR capabilities, the American forces of these two combat companies, the Charlie and Delta Company, were forced in their retreat to move exceedingly slowly along I-820, which this route had inadvertently shielded them from the PLA's use of some of their heaviest weapons, allowing for them to effectively move in relative safety, as the PLA wanted the entire highway network as much intact as was humanly possible. And thus, as these forces moved incredibly slow in order to maintain communications through line-of-sight communications, such as hand gestures and flag waving and others, as well as also earshot communications in some instances, they also used runners to spread messages over slightly longer distances as well, in order to spread messages and communicate. Although this was not always effective, it was the best that they could do under such conditions, having had the tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes and on-booting of electronic warfare assets, even removing the redundant communications as it pertained to the electronic warfare systems, such as radio and also even portable radar that was not dependent upon satellite or internet to function, such as air defense radars, for instance, or multi-mission radars. This effectively left American forces with no eyes and ears beyond what they could see literally in front of them in terms of enemy forces. With the PLA having total AI and ISR dominance, this allowed for the PLA to see where American forces were at all times, and this ability enabled them to maneuver their forces in such a way to where they could easily surround American units who were none the wiser until it was too late, and the PLA forces had surrounded and enveloped them in kill boxes and also cordon and sweep operations. As it pertained to the combat operations throughout the Metroplex that were occurring concurrently at this time, many major combat operations for the capture and or destruction of key objectives were winding down by this point in time, although there were still more combat operations to come. The largest and most key objectives were in the process of being completely secured and again or destroyed by this time, at the same time as the Charlie and Delta companies of the 1st of the 124th Cav Squadron were being completely cut off, surrounded, and engaged. As the DFW International Airport, for instance, was in the final phases of the battle that was unfolding in this particular area, as the 5 different battalions, 2 air assault battalions from the active duty PLA 83rd Group Army's 83rd Air Assault Brigade that were attached to the PLA Ready Reserve 59th Group Army were working together in conjunction with 3 armored battalions from the 35th Armored Brigade of the 59th PLA Group Army, as they were in the final phases again of completely clearing and seizing and consolidating their positions in the DFW International Airport, which was, by the way, a massive objective of the PLA in this particular campaign. There were other battles elsewhere in the city that were winding down for additional major objectives as well. This also included the complete and total seizure intact of the downtown of Dallas, which was to be used as one of 2 chief red zones, which were effectively to be fortified colonial settlements for the first Chinese colonists to arrive in the new colony post-victory over America. As the armored battalion that was working hand in hand with the air assault battalion tasked with seizing the downtown of Dallas intact was also likewise wrapping up their final operation to destroy the 2nd of the 198th, which was the heaviest American unit within the entire Metroplex, which this particular battalion, part of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, was attached to the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team charged with the defense of critical sites throughout the city. As the downtown of Dallas was imminently about to completely fall under PLA control, as well as the DFW International Airport, the downtown of Fort Worth was also in the final phases of being completely cleared of enemy forces, as there were thousands of armed reactionary civilians holed up in different buildings, as many of them found upon exiting the buildings that they became easy targets for attack helo gunships from the air assault battalion charged with capturing the downtown of Fort Worth, as well as also loitering munition strikes and other weapons types, even 82 millimeter mortars from the mortar company within the air assault battalion, which was using its air assault infantry companies to clear each and every major building in the downtown, to seize the downtown and use it as a colonial red zone, as they were doing with downtown Dallas. As all of this was occurring closer to the fighting that was about to unfold in the southwest of the city, immediately to the east, in the southeast of the city of Fort Worth, the elite Special Operations Forces of the PLA 59th Group Army of their 59th Special Operations Battalion were in the process now of completely and totally capturing the command elements of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, using all of the resources they had at their disposal, including even massive artillery support from the 19th Artillery Brigades to Type 83 MLRS battalions, which were the 122 millimeter multiple launch rocket systems of the PHL-81 family, which were the Type 83s being an upgrade on these. They offered considerable firepower to completely eradicate entire areas, whereupon there sat enemy forces of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, some of which of its elements had also been trapped in the encirclement carried out by the Special Operations Forces, along with the headquarters of Headquarters Company, within which the command elements were wanted alive, as their intelligence value would be immense. Added to the already massive cyber intelligence arm of the PLA alongside of its AI intelligence capabilities, the human intelligence aspects still would see interrogations conducted by PLA military intelligence and the MSS, or Ministry for State Security, the Chinese secret police and foreign intelligence service all rolled together into one agency. They worked closely with PLA military intelligence when it came to interrogating high-value prisoners, which included high-ranking military and political officials of enemy nations that were captured. Again, because these special operations forces were highly elite and exceedingly well-trained troops, they were the obvious choice to use to capture high-ranking enemy personnel alive. Thus, they were sent into the area to flush out a public housing projects wherein the command elements ended up finding themselves trapped as they became caught in this unflattering area of the city, what in layman's terms could be described as the hood. These forces decided that the public housing projects had the most sturdy buildings, as these were brick buildings, that could resist some types of small arms fire. And although the PLA could have easily destroyed these buildings, they opted to go in a highly surgical, tactical manner to clear out these buildings and again seize the command elements alive. To the immediate south of this operation being conducted by the Special Operations Forces in this part of the city was the two battalions from the 16th Infantry Division that were operating in the Burleson area, which was an area where a CCP property that was a major supply base along I-35W for all of the external invasion forces effectively moving on this route to be able to stop to conduct logistical resupply operations on their long trek deep inland as they moved and raced as fast as they could into the American heartland, which effectively was Kansas, so to speak, although they would shed off a few group armies en route as the group armies 7 through 13 were traveling up I-35 from the Mexican border. They would effectively only have to stop to conduct logistical resupply operations and effectively not have to waste time engaging enemy forces, as this was the job of the Trojan shock armies who operated in the key nodes, which were the major and medium cities en route along the major invasion routes, and even some of the smaller cities that held certain key objectives needing to be addressed and captured by the Trojan shock forces themselves. As one of two armored battalions from the 16th Infantry Division of the PLA 59th Group Army and one mechanized infantry division operating along with them in Burleson were already in the latter stages of completely capturing this city and this key segment of I-35W within which the external invasion forces would travel and again exit to conduct logistical resupply operations, hence the requirement to capture Burleson being a very important objective, as these two battalions would engage over 1,000 armed reactionary civilians. They would not stand a chance against these very powerful armored forces. As now, with the two companies being trapped as they had tried to exit the I-820 road system as they traveled along the access road, they would now make an attempt at a breakout of the urban death trap that was now developing, known as the DFW Battle space, and effectively try to make for the wooded areas which lay on the outskirts of the metro area, within which they would attempt to try to hide and regroup if they could so make it. However, as the gargantuan PLA surveillance apparatus was so large and all-encompassing throughout this battle space, every single solitary enemy force was seen with all their movements tracked, which included these two companies, and they would not escape, as again, the very same two battalions which had assaulted the defending forces of the 1st of the 124th that were both to the east of and north of the installation, the Naval Air Station, were the same two battalions that, upon logistical resupply operations within an hour-long period being completed, would pursue, hook around, and envelop and destroy these two companies. As these companies exited the highway system, they would end up being separated by a whole kilometer, as Charlie Company would get a bit further ahead of the Delta Company, which would end up left behind in an industrial area by major rail lines, while a kilometer away, as this kilometer space was effectively a wooded and field area of fields and small shops every so often along the roadways, separating a wealthy upscale neighborhood from this industrial area filled with many warehouse buildings, offices of businesses, and also some factory complexes. These forces being spread out would be engaged in these two different areas, with this pocket ending up being cut in two as one of the light mechanized infantry companies from the light mechanized infantry battalion from the 24th Light Infantry Brigade of the PLA would effectively move into the kilometer-wide gap that separated the two American combat companies, and thus they would be consolidated into two smaller pockets and would be flushed out with very heavy firepower as these forces would be engaged by armor and light mechanized infantry forces, as the artillery firepower support would be immense. The 152 millimeter howitzers, the PLL 66 towed howitzers, and the PLL 01 towed howitzers, which are 155 millimeter, would be on call for this operation, as they were conducting enormous amounts of fire missions, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system would prepare strike packages that would be sent down to the FDCs of these different batteries of these battalions and make fire missions a rapid affair, as fire missions could be put together faster than was ever before possible before the advent of this real-time AI battlefield data processing system. Enemy forces found themselves under constant threat of total annihilation from the sheer volume of firepower that could be shifted upon them at any time, as the PLA was now a highly flexible and very rapid acting force due to their use of artificial intelligence to streamline all the battlefield data and even put together strike packages, not only for the artillery, but for other types of elements as well, including even the fire support elements within the different battalions of the maneuver battalions, which also included anti-tank units such as the AFT-10 company within the armored battalions, as the armored battalion with its AFT-10s, which could sit back further away from the battlefield with their max range of 6.2 miles and fire their very powerful HJ-10 ATGMs at relatively long range to hit targets in support of the maneuver elements, which consisted of the armored forces and armored infantry, as also each battalion, of course, had their headquarters and support company, which was effectively their command and logistical elements, which would continuously supply and command the troops during their operations, as the Americans trapped in the industrial area would be hit hard with everything from tank shells and heavy machine gun turret fire, as well as coaxial machine gun fire from the main battle tanks, as well as also ATGM strikes from Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drones on vehicles below, as well as also CH-901A loitering munition strikes, and also even artillery firepower, which would be immense. These forces would effectively be annihilated in a relatively short time, as the battle overall would last an hour in the industrial zone. The main combat aspect of the battle would only last just over 30 minutes, as the maneuvering into place of these forces for the battle took 30 minutes itself, with the actual combat lasting only 30. However, the combat, as the light mechanized infantry would participate in the industrial site combat as well, combat in the suburban area would last a little bit longer, as the suburban area combat effectively would be a 1 hour and 20-minute long affair, and this would be mostly due to the battalion commander of the armored battalion desiring to limit the amount of non-combatant casualties, at least initially, until they would be forced to use heavier weapons as the battle would effectively drag on, as initially the PLA tried to avoid non-combatant casualties any time they could, as they were now operating in a residential neighborhood and a wealthy upscale one at that, not all of the residents of the neighborhood had yet fled their homes, and many were still moving from home to home, as some homes were abandoned already by now, and people were moving between them, and armed reactionary civilians were also hiding in some of these homes and would emerge to engage PLA troops as they would fight alongside of their military counterparts as the armed reactionary civilians and Charlie Company in the suburban neighborhood would effectively be spread out throughout the wealthy upscale neighborhood in an area that was effectively a 1 mile long east-west by 1 kilometer north-south area where most of these forces were concentrated, and thus the PLA, already having had again surrounded a larger pocket and then cut it in two, had the dividing light mechanized infantry company from the light mechanized infantry battalion of the 24th Light Infantry Brigade between the upscale neighborhood and the industrial site that was slightly to the northeast of the wealthy upscale neighborhood. And in between the headquarters platoon of Charlie Company and the mechanized infantry forces of the single mechanized infantry company from the light mechanized infantry battalion were armed reactionary civilians attempting to fight against the column of vehicles which consisted of the company's IFVs and APCs, which effectively stretched out along a roadway that separated the wealthy neighborhood from the industrial area, and would challenge these vehicles, who all had interlocking fields of fire as their weapons were staggered in order to cover all directions of approach, as they acted as a force that would partition the pocket in two. As these were very powerful vehicles with massive firepower advantage, the armed reactionary civilians could do little to nothing at all against these forces. As it pertained to the rest of the pocket, besides the one armored infantry company, the two tank companies, and one light mechanized infantry company, and one platoon from the light mechanized infantry battalion's anti-tank company, which was its fire support company of WZ-550 anti-tank vehicles, as the anti-tank company within the light mechanized infantry battalion was effectively broken up, with all four of its combat platoons being spread among the light mechanized infantry companies to support them as best as possible, with the headquarters platoon of the anti-tank company on standby to provide logistical support to their vehicles as they would utilize their HJ-09 ATGMs. The spread out nature of these forces aided in the ability to project firepower throughout this relatively sizable pocket, as the armored infantry company that was not in use in combat operations against the American forces in the pocket, which is now divided again by one of six light mechanized infantry companies, with the other light mechanized infantry company engaged against the Delta Company, with the four remaining light mechanized infantry companies holding areas on the perimeter of the pocket, along with the remaining non-used armored infantry company, one of two, the other being used in the suburban area to clear it, and the other two tank companies not in use, with the anti-tank company of the AFT-10 sitting further back with the headquarters and support company of the armored battalion, which was commanding the operation and carrying out logistical support of its armored forces, as was the headquarters and support company of the light mechanized infantry battalion, also sitting back and away from the pocket. The forces would begin engaging in both portions of the pocket at 3:15 a.m. as the area was now surrounded completely by this point, as the light mechanized infantry battalion was again the first to arrive on scene, which hooked around coming from the north, hooking east as they moved south. They were then joined by the armored battalion, who then both committed forces to engage the Americans trapped in this pocket. As we go to the map of the suburban area, the tank company committed and the armored infantry company committed would be working together within the context of this particular battle, as they, again, initially preferred to try to limit non-combatant casualties, as there were still several thousand non-combatants in this particular area, even some that before the area had been surrounded had moved into the area from other areas that were receiving artillery bombardment or other types of crossfire or battles where enemy forces traversed the area and engaged armed reactionary civilians or other types of situations, and thus many civilians at this time were in flux throughout the city. There were many abandoned and unused vehicles, as people realized that being in a vehicle was highly dangerous at this point, as well as also there were many who were moving around on foot, again, from place to place. And as there were several thousand in this large, upscale, wealthy neighborhood, which, although it looks relatively small, is actually a large area, being a 1 mile by 1 kilometer area, because many of the homes in this area were effectively mansions. They were larger than 3,000 square feet and larger, and they had very large yards. And behind these massively large blocks, where these houses were actually widely spread out with large yards, were walking parks with walking trails for the people on this block to enjoy, as well as also in this block, and this block, this block, and this block here, as well as also the walking park wherein the headquarters platoon, which was the command and logistical forces over the Charlie Company, had effectively taken up their position, as there were also armed reactionary civilians, as the light green is the military personnel, the darker green being armed reactionary civilian elements. Many of them would emerge from homes, and as this became a constant threat and activity that was spotted by the quadcopter and high-altitude drone recon assets, as well as satellite, all interlocking and mapping the area in real time, and effectively acting as the eyes and ears for the real-time AI battlefield data processing system to continually update the combat data links, as well as put together strike packages and more. The PLA would opt to use heavier weapons as they proceeded through the area, because they would realize that effectively they had no other choice. Again, although at first, initially, they wanted to limit any types of non-combatant casualties because this was a large and wealthy neighborhood, they eventually abandoned this idea because the threats became too numerous in terms of the numbers of enemy personnel, including armed reactionary civilians, and their spread out nature, and thus eventually artillery would be relied upon to shell portions of this neighborhood, as well as also the heavy use of anti-tank guided missiles from the AFT-10 company, the anti-tank company, within the armored battalion, as there were 4 combat platoons of 5 of these vehicles per platoon and their headquarters platoon. 2 platoons each of the 4 combat platoons would be utilized in the 2 different battle zones, which included the wealthy upscale suburban neighborhood and the industrial site, which was to the northeast of the suburban neighborhood, as 2 platoons each of the AFT-10s would be dedicated to supporting their armored forces and even the light mechanized infantry in the industrial site. They would effectively be in position and set up minutes into the battle and would then be able to contribute fully to the operation, as the PLA forces initially in the suburban area would be clearing the flanks of their vehicles, as the armored infantry would be the main striking force, although there would also be one of the 4 tank platoons contributed with a squad of armored infantry to clear the flanks that were to the slight south and east of the main advance of the armored infantry forces. The platoon of Type 96Bs that would be sent in to clear the flanks with a squad of armored infantry troops would effectively be moving up the street at a relatively slow pace in order to, again, offer flank clearance support for the main thrust of the armored infantry company's 3 combat platoons, which consisted of an IFV per platoon, which were the three ZBDO-4As bristling with their very powerful weaponry in the form of a 100mm main gun, a 30mm autocannon, and two HJ09 ATGM pods on the sides of the turret, as well as also even a 7.62 by 54mm coaxial machine gun to boot, which was very effective against infantry forces that were very near the vehicle. As well as also there were the Type 89A armor personnel carriers, 4 per platoon, with their heavy machine gun turret, which boasted a 12.7mm W85 heavy machine gun, as most of the troops, minus 4 squads initially in the lead platoon, were all dismounted. They would also have armored support from the 3 other main battle tank platoons that would sit a bit further back and be able to use their range advantage, as they could fire far beyond the range of this entire map, as their main gun had a range of several miles. The tanks would effectively initially fire through gaps in the homes, trying to avoid hitting the homes again to try to spare any types of non-combatants, although eventually this would be abandoned later in the fighting as this battle would go on. This battle, the actual combat portion of it, would last about 50 minutes, as the maneuvering into place for this operation took approximately 30 minutes as they moved out and away from the perimeter, with the other forces filling in as they left the perimeter where they were originally at as they surrounded these forces. They, now being in place, would have 2 of their 4 tank platoons in the center, as there were 3 other tanks just off the map here, and 1 platoon in the north, and again, their flank clearance platoon of main battle tanks, Type 96Bs, in the south and slightly east. That would move northeast up the street at a slow pace, as the 3 combat companies of armored infantry forces, leaving their headquarters platoon behind, would also move up the street as well. There was a dismounted platoon, as this squad, there were 3 headquarters platoon troops on the roof here, as they had their vehicles in a defensive wagon-type circle along this shopping center that was across the field in this drainage ditch, which was very long, which ran underneath the road here. These are drainage culverts here, and also ran along the high school, another culvert under this street here. They effectively would hold position at this gas station to provide additional security for the headquarters platoon troops by holding position here and having fields of fire that would cover this area, as the rest of their platoon would effectively advance alongside of the flanks of their vehicles of their 3 combat platoons. As this effectively was a perfect example of an armored phalanx, as this was a double column of vehicles. Each vehicle had interlocking 180-degree fields of fire for their turrets in the case of the IFVs, or their gunners in the case of the armor personnel carriers, and had interlocking fields of fire, which means they could mutually support one another on either side, with the last vehicle taking up the rear of the column, having a 180-degree field of fire to cover the back of the entire column. These vehicles would move continuously up the street in this type of formation in order to watch all sides tactically and mutually support their dismounted armored infantry troops, who would clear the flanks alongside of the armored infantry forces. And again, there would be a minor flank clearance operation just to the southeast of the main drive that was to effectively destroy the majority of the Charlie Company, and also the appearance of the armed reactionary civilians as well, who are now making their presence known in this area, as fields of fire would be very important as an aspect of this battle. There would be many different types of vehicles and the troops that would be able to all be mutually supporting as they continually move through the area. And again, they would move cautiously, again, in order, at least initially, to avoid any types of non-combatant casualties, but eventually this would be abandoned, as the battalion commander being very similar to the battalion commander in the San Antonio battle of the Russian battalion that was tasked with clearing the mall, wanted to avoid civilian casualties, as in non-combatants. But again, this would be abandoned as soon as it was clear that this place was infested with combatants. And again, artillery would be called in and other heavy weapons, and the combat would become even more savage. Another contribution to the battalion commander's decision would be the use of two different improvised devices, which were haphazardly placed as there was not much time to prepare proper ambushes with these systems, as Charlie Company had been mistakenly delivered heat rounds, which were supposed to go to the Alpha Company of the 1st of the 124th, the Tank Company. And as they received these heat rounds, they eventually utilized these to their advantage and daisy-chained them with other implements to create a truck-based improvised device to attempt to cause damage to or destroy some PLA forces. Although they had to abandon this truck, which was an LMTV, which they left as one of their supply trucks. They left it here in this field, as these brown marks here signify trees and wooded areas. They left it in this field, and as PLA armor inspected it with their quadcopter assets and, of course, their optics, they could see that it was effectively an abandoned truck, and as they thought it suspicious, they decided to destroy it as they fired a heat round into it and made a massive explosion. As there was also an armed reactionary civilian who had unlawfully, before the invasion, been tinkering around himself, as he had special skills, as this was not completely uncommon, as in some places there were personnel in the armed civilian ranks that had these capabilities. This man had effectively pulled out his own system in the back of a pickup truck that was rigged up, but it too would be seen from far away by the quadcopter reconnaissance assets and the tank optics, and would be destroyed by this lead main battle tank firing a heat shell into it. But the blast would be relatively large and would destroy these homes and even wipe out an armed reactionary civilian taking cover behind this building. As behind that home. As these forces now moved into place, as these main battle tanks had rolled in after destroying this truck-based improvised device, armed reactionary civilians had moved out of this home and had begun to get into a short-lived firefight with this PLA squad of armored infantry troops, which had bounded into this drainage ditch upon having dismounted their vehicle, as there were two full dismounted platoons and a single squad from the lead platoon that was dismounted and was assigned to effectively provide infantry support to the tank platoon that was clearing the flanks to the south and east of the battle space here. The remaining mounted squads in the lead platoon would effectively be gradually dismounted, with two being dismounted as they would make that, as the vehicle column would make it to this intersection, with the rest being dismounted to clear the area of any remaining elements of the headquarters platoon, which would be savagely annihilated by a combination of weapons by the time the PLA forces got within range of these forces, as in where they had visual range and were able to use their direct fire weapons. The vehicles initially, as there's so much activity occurring on this map all at the same time, it will be attempted to be covered as best as possible, as this is a very complicated battle map, and as these forces were moving up in their vehicle column, of their double column vehicle armored phalanx formation here, the armed reactionary civilians had a brief firefight with this squad, which laid down supporting and covering fire for this wedge formation squad to get into the drainage ditch and fold out into a line formation. Initially, this squad in the far north, which was providing mutual support to the armor, was bounding in two half squads. As this squad made it into the drainage ditch and prepared to lay down supporting fire, this half squad bounded in to join and remake a full squad. As the armor would move up, this squad would remain in position as the main battle tanks with the quadcopter assets mapping the area in real time would discover two M113 APCs that were just off map and could be seen through gaps in the homes, and thus the two tanks on the north of this platoon would fire and destroy these two armored personnel carriers, as they could be fired at through gaps in the yards of these homes as they could be seen. As this M113 could likewise be seen through the gaps, it too was fired at and destroyed by a heat shell from the third, or the middle, Type 96B main battle tank of this platoon in the north. As that had occurred, 3 additional personnel were KIA'd, and there were 2 wounded as well that were close by where the shell impacted and destroyed this vehicle, with the rest of the squad, including the wounded, evacuating the area. The actions here were occurring relatively quickly as they tried to provide some type of emergency medical aid to the wounded before they were to completely try to retreat from the area as these vehicles were gradually and slowly moving up. These armed reactionary civilians, having had been cut down, would allow for these 2 squads to advance and bound to clear flanks on the north flank of the vehicle column, as in the center of this operation, or effectively to the immediate south of the advance of the vehicles of the 3 combat platoons of the Armored Infantry Company, were the other dismounted platoon from the Armored Infantry Company out of their vehicles, who, having main battle tank support from 2 main battle tank platoons, with the headquarters platoon in a wagon circle with their MRAPs, Tiger MRAPs, with their 12.7 millimeter WD-5 heavy machine guns, and all the lighter vehicles, the command vehicle, armored ambulance, and armored recovery vehicle, and supply trucks, all within this defensive wagon circle. But they also had their 2 tank platoons in the center of this operation here that could also provide them protection from any combatants in this area. The advance of this platoon here in the center, just south of the main advance of the vehicles, was to clear this high school that was within this neighborhood to the immediate west of the wealthy upscale neighborhood, and also to the slight north of the rest of it. This was on the outer edges of the neighborhood, but it was suspected that there were refugees that were taking shelter within the high school, and thus great care would be taken not to destroy the high school, at least initially, because they did not want to fire tank shells into it and risk harming non-combatants, although there were American combatants outside of the high school, with one group being armed reactionary civilians that were taking cover by the football field and would be hit by a combination of systems, one being a loitering munition, a CH-901A, the rest being heavy machine gun fire being vectored in from the moving column as they moved up the street very slowly. They were firing 12.7 millimeter fire over this drainage ditch and into these personnel laying by the end of the football field here. These are bleachers, effectively. And as that was occurring, that allowed for the small arms fire coming from this double column formation from the side of the column that was facing this direction, as they could vector their fire into it from this direction, and an L vector tactically of fire from the vehicles and the troops, and the small arms fire coming from this wedge formation in 2 different directions. They bounded into the safety of this drainage ditch and lost nobody, because the suppressing fire was so powerful that they had to keep their heads down in the prone position, but most of them were being shredded up by it, including the squad of dismounted American troops from one of the 2 platoons, as the platoon that was on either end of this spread out area had both platoons deployed 2 squads each to the high school to take up positions here to act as a scouting, reconnaissance / blocking force, as they wanted to use this high school as effectively a reconnaissance post where they could look out the windows and see what was coming and be able to send personnel back to warn the main body of the forces about the approach of enemy forces, as they realized initially that they were already surrounded, as their small scouting parties had already returned and informed the company captain, the commander of the company, that the American forces were completely and totally surrounded, and thus they opted to send
4 squads from 2 different combat platoons to occupy the high school and use it as effectively a reconnaissance post, because it could watch these 2 main roads that led into this wealthy upscale neighborhood on either side, and thus they also opted to use it as a strong point, and they attempted to fire AT-4s, and they tried to fire them at the main battle tanks, which effectively did nothing to them, as these main battle tanks not only had outstanding base armor underneath their ERA plating, but they had the ERA plating as well, and the AT-4 was not enough to penetrate this, and only one AT-4 would hit one main battle tank, but effectively do nothing, as the tanks also fired Frag T shells into these personnel at the same time as this squad got off one AT-4 shot. The Frag T shells hit and destroyed these forces, as their squad leader was the only one to survive. He was cut down by an array of fire coming from not just the heavy machine guns on the Type 89A armor personnel carriers, but also being fired at by the small arms of the troops now in the drainage ditch, as they were effectively firing everything from their 35 millimeter tube fired grenades from beneath the rifles of troops that carried those, like so, as well as also they were firing their QBJ-201 light machine gun. Also, the riflemen were firing their QBZ-95 rifles, and of course, there were troops that also had the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, both with the anti-armor and anti-personnel rounds, and those were being fired as well. The anti-personnel rounds, especially, with the anti-armor rounds being fired only at the high school when there was seen muzzle flashes coming from certain windows of the building, as well as also carrying the even more powerful man-portable HJ-08 anti-tank guided missile systems per squad as well. There was a ATGM man in each squad, as there were more of these weapons stockpiled in the APCs and IFVs. For the time, these troops didn't have access to them because they were tasked with clearing the high school and also moving ahead to engage the center platoon of the American defending forces, as this whole area was being flushed out and effectively in a massive cordon and sweep operation, as the high school, being the reconnaissance strong point of the American forces in the area of Charlie Company, these 2 squads, after decimating this squad and these personnel, were also joined by these squads and a 3rd squad from their platoon, as these 3 squads were the other 3 of the same platoon as these 2, were assaulting the high school from its front door and would eventually send a squad around to the back. As per proper building clearance procedures, there would be squads waiting outside while other squads cleared the building, as per building clearance procedures, as vehicles or troops normally would wait outside of a building that's being cleared to offer support and prevent retreats or send in forces to assist in the building clearance operations, as this squad moving into place and folding out into a line formation in the drainage ditch would lay down heavy supporting fire against these 2 armed reactionary civilians and this squad of American troops behind this large concrete abutment where cars could pass underneath the overhang that was outside of the main entrance of the school, as there was a parking lot separated by 2 concrete abutments, one by the street, one further up by the school, as the elevation gradually changed and was moving more and more upward as these forces moved in. Their direct fire weapons could hit some targets, but due to the change in elevation, this required them in some cases to have to get closer in order for their weapons to be more effective, as the terrain variations sometimes made it possible for troops laying in the prone position or vehicles that were further enough away from the elevation to not be able to be directly hit by some of these very powerful vehicle-based systems, or even by the weapons carried by some of the troops. However, the tanks could elevate their main guns roughly 30 degrees or so and were able to vector fire, but it would overshoot some targets just depending on how close they were and how the terrain features changed. All of these calculations were guided by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, and all of the strike packages when it would come to artillery and also even the fire support elements within the battalion, such as the AFT-10s, which are the HJ-10 based system, which could fire their missiles in an arc, unlike the more direct fire HJ-09 WZ-550 based systems, as well as also influencing the AI target seeking modes on these heat warhead equipped CH-901As, could assist in hitting targets that sometimes the vehicles just might not be able to connect with in terms of their main weaponry. As the school was being cleared as these vehicles were slowly moving ahead up the street, and the main battle tank had already destroyed this APC, and these two tanks on the end destroyed the other two. All that was left was the Bradley IFV, which was still hiding behind this home in position, ready in an ambush position, but would eventually try to flee along with these troops who were trying to conduct emergency first aid on their wounded troops from the tank shell that had also caused several KIAs behind the vehicle from the squad that had dismounted from this vehicle in the wedge formation initially. These squads would eventually move up and take position as their vehicles were slowly moving ahead, and then would continue their movements to continue to clear flanks alongside the vehicle column. Same on this side, as clearing the high school, which was again a strong point / recon post for these forces of the Charlie Company squads, was to be cleared as the vehicles are moving ahead, to allow these forces to continue to press ahead as well, to aid this main strike force in effectively mopping up the vast majority of Charlie Company, with the platoon of main battle tanks moving slowly up the street as well to conduct the clearance on the flanks of the operation, including wiping out the remains of the platoon of Charlie Company that was in this particular side of the neighborhood. As again, early on, the main battle tanks had already destroyed, through shooting through gaps in the houses, the three here had already destroyed the other two APCs. All that was left was a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle and another M113. And over on this side, all that was left was the Bradley, as the other three APCs had already now been destroyed very early in the fighting. As now, the area being cleared with the high school, the L-vectoring of fire tactically from the drainage ditch, as well as also from the squad from their same platoon that was moving up the street along with the main battle tanks, as there was the column from one main battle tank platoon, along with the double column rolling shield squad from the lead platoon of the armored infantry, moving up the street here of the Armored Infantry Company, which was this double column rolling shield. But there was also the line formation squad from this platoon as they were moving in a line formation up the street alongside the main battle tanks on this side, but would depart from the main battle tank column and clear flanks through the center on the side of the main battle tank advance, but also to assist in the main thrust of the Armored Infantry Company into the neighborhood. As this squad was laying down, supporting fire, this squad started moving gradually and into the ditch, as this squad had taken position along the abutment and L-vectored fire, and the main battle tank had their turret gunner that was facing this direction, as they had interlocking fields of fire, and they had 180-degree fire zones where they could mutually support the column on all sides of the vehicle. Fields of fire. They fired at these forces and wiped them out, allowing for the rolling T to stop in this position after they held their fire, allowing for them to bound and take cover here and face the school to support the rolling T moving in, as they were in a rolling T formation to face the upper windows and the lower floor entrance to effectively watch and cover all their bases as they entered tactically and breached the building. So they wanted to make sure that the upper floors didn't have any personnel that were trying to fire out at them as they breached the building. But once they got into the first floor, they effectively got into their initial firefights as they entered. As you can see, there's red, but also green on the arrow here as this squad enters tactically in the rolling T formation, while this squad is watching the upper floors. There's red here because they're firing at muzzle flashes, as there are some troops that go to the windows after the squad breaches and fire back out at these forces, and there's effectively a short firefight where they take out these personnel in the window before they then advance around toward the back while this squad's clearing, and they hold their position as these two squads had since moved through this football field out here and taken position along this elevation here, which is similar to the concept of being in a drainage ditch. As the elevation starts to effectively become more hilly, they can lay down on the hill and effectively hold their positions and use it as a fighting position outside of the school. And the same happens with this squad here in the single line formation after they took cover here to assist in eliminating these forces in the L vector of fire initially before this squad came around to hold the position here, allowing for them to then move to this terrain slope here and take position along this elevation as the tanks are slowly moving up. This double column rolling shield formation had effectively broken off and laid down heavy fire on these armed reactionary civilians from this position between these two large homes. And also this squad that had emerged, one squad from this platoon, had emerged from this house to engage these forces, the squad, as they took position between the homes. They laid down fire on these forces, and by this time, as this was occurring, the HJ-10s were now completely set up, and the two platoons dedicated from the AFT-10 company were now firing HJ-10s in support of these armored forces operating in this neighborhood. As they fired HJ-10s, which slammed into this squad right here between these homes and also these armed reactionary civilians as they came around and started to fire at them from a new position, they were completely and totally wiped out. As these loitering munitions were entering the area, this squad now moved back alongside the tanks as they were at this position at this point in time. Loitering munitions were loitering the battlefield looking for targets, and they would slam into this M113 as well as some troops from the dismounted squad from the M113 that were right in this position here. This squad initially came from one of the two that had been destroyed off map by the main battle tanks from these two platoons. This platoon on the very end of these two platoons, having had fired at them early on, destroyed them. The troops, having had been dismounted, were still operational and still in the area and had to be dealt with, and thus they would be effectively pursued as these forces moved through the area to flush them out and annihilate them in this cordon and sweep operation. As now, these squads had moved up alongside of their slower moving vehicles while the high school was being cleared. Combat inside the high school effectively was a room-to-room, hall-to-hall, office-to-office, gymnasium and cafeteria affair where these squads, effectively in stack team formations, moved on all floors of this building, clearing them of these two squads of American troops, which had already now lost some personnel from the combat, from the exchange of fire between the forces outside and those who came to the windows. But the rest of these two squads, the squad now having had entered the back after the squad rolling T had already entered the front, were now thoroughly sweeping the building. It was basically two squads against two squads, and this squad would be effectively completely annihilated as none of these troops would opt to surrender, and they all went down swinging. They all went down fighting. These two squads would continue to hold the high school while the rest of their platoon continued to move ahead down the center of the operation. As these vehicles moved up and these squads were in these positions here, the squad would move into this house while this squad would stay at the corner as their vehicles were moving up. This squad would be dismounted from this lead platoon. Again, the lead platoon also had effectively given one of their squads to this tank platoon to effectively aid them as infantry support as they moved up the street. These two squads, having had been dismounted, would take positions at these homes, with this squad going around and outflanking this half squad of American troops. While this squad had bounded across the street, taken a corner, this vehicle already destroyed and scrap metal from the heat round was burning and smoking as the aluminum alloy could catch fire relatively easily in many cases. This was already burning and smoking. It was a bunch of scrap metal that was ripped to pieces, and there were corpses of the KIA troops that were behind it still, as those troops were checked, and as soon as they were deemed KIAs, the priority went to treating the wounded as they moved them away out of the gap, away from the gap. As this squad then moved forward and held a position here, they laid down fire on these forces as that was occurring, and these troops had already outflanked these forces and held their position here. They both had fields of fire covering this area, and they were laying down fire and exchanging it with these troops. The troops that had been treating the wounded were returning fire back, but it was all to no avail because by that time, this squad had bounded ahead after this had been dealt with, and the vehicles were continuing to move up the street as all of this was occurring. And the Bradley had tried to fire a few 20 millimeter rounds, but again, to no avail. The return fire was meted out from the very powerful 30 millimeter autocannon with its armor piercing, or its HE armor piercing ammunition could shred a Bradley to scrap, or a shell from the main weapon, the 100 millimeter cannon, or even the two very powerful HJ09 pods. But the 30 millimeter autocannon was opted for use against the Bradley, and the Bradley reversed exceedingly fast out of the area and tried to effectively escape. And it laid down some fire against these troops, but it was too late, because eventually, as the lead IFV got to this gap, it fired its 30 millimeter autocannon, shredding the Bradley to pieces, as the 20 millimeter fire would wound a few of the PLA troops, falling short of actually hitting them. The shrapnel from the blasts of the 20 millimeter would cut some of the troops into their legs and other extremities, arms and such, and they would have to be treated and medevaced out of the area as this combat had concluded here. The squad holding their position along the vehicles was occurring as this squad had moved through this area after the vehicles had cut this half squad down as they moved through, as again they had basically an armored phalanx as they used their heavy machine guns, their 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire, as well as also the lead IFV using its 30 millimeter autocannon to destroy these forces. This half squad, as this squad had dismounted to take position in this home, coming out of the garage and holding position here, they then would effectively, as this vehicle again had been destroyed by fire coming from the 100 millimeter main gun from the lead IFV in this column here, this vehicle was destroyed, allowing then for these two squads that had moved here to effectively move through these homes and then take up position by the burning, smoking vehicle between these homes with this other squad. And this squad, after cutting down armed reactionary civilians, which didn't even see it coming as they were seen by the quadcopter assets first, just as these vehicles were all seen, they were cut down by small arms fire from inside this house by this squad, before the squad then advanced and bolted to get to this terrain, as these troops here were already now under heavy fire, as this squad had bounded to this position, was exchanging fire with these forces, and even fired a rocket-propelled grenade round, which the soldier was firing it frantically, and the aim was a little bit low, and it crashed into the ground with an anti-armor round and basically caused this M113 to reverse while trying to fire at these forces taking cover effectively on the dirt on the hillside. And the fighting here became effectively a very serious and heavy fight between the not only the dismounted infantry troops, but there would also be HJ-10 support coming in, as well as also soon artillery support, as again the combat was now becoming relatively heavy, as the American forces, seeing as how spread out they were, and all of the armed reactionary civilians emerging to join in the combat, would require heavier weapons to be utilized. As HJ-10 fire came in about the same time as the first artillery fire missions came in, they slammed and destroyed this M113 with repeated 155 millimeter strikes from several different howitzers into this area as they retreated, firing at these forces. There would be a few PLA KIAs, as there would be two PLA troops from the squad who would effectively raise their head up, and the 50 cal on this retreating vehicle would effectively shred right through them and blow them into pieces as the vehicle retreated. And as these forces, seeing as the artillery began to strike and destroy this vehicle, these troops of this diamond formation, which had originally been in a diamond to watch all directions of this park in support of their vehicles, they now, having had lost troops in the exchange of fire between these forces, would bound ahead, knowing that the PLA would not do danger close strikes if they were within mere yards of their enemy, and close quarters combat effectively ensued on this hillside. And PLA troops and American troops, the remaining members of the squad, were not only firing at each other nearly point-blank range, but there were effectively rifle checks and rifle butts in faces and more. Also, even a knife attack from a bayonet of a PLA soldier against an American soldier. And the PLA would lose another soldier in this exchange, but the American troops would effectively all be wiped out by the close quarters combat, as not only were the PLA forces fighting here, but again, they had support because these troops were also firing at them, guided by the quadcopter assets, the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. And as all of that was occurring and the artillery destroyed this M113, this Bradley was also likewise destroyed by artillery strikes, and this M113 as well, and all these armed reactionary civilians, and these homes were completely wiped out in artillery strikes because armed reactionary civilians had emerged from these homes, and thus they were all destroyed, and this walking park became full of craters as repeated 155 and 152 millimeter strikes from the PLL-66s, and again 155 strikes from the PLL-01s, all came in from the devoted batteries of these two different battalions, the PLL-01 battalion and the PLL-66 battalion, that were devoted to this operation. And they smashed these vehicles and personnel that were in this walking park area. As that had occurred, this squad that emerged from the home after eliminating these armed reactionary civilians had, allowing for these troops to get here, had bounded ahead after engaging these forces and effectively ended up in this position as the vehicles had advanced. Again, while all this was going on, these vehicles were moving up, and these personnel had already been engaged and destroyed by a combination of vehicle-based fire and fire from the squad, allowing them to advance to this position while the vehicles effectively stopped here. And then this squad would bound ahead, and then the vehicles would continue moving slowly ahead as this area was effectively being consolidated by the troops. While all that was happening at the same time, by then the tanks had made it to this position here and were effectively rolling into their spot right before the artillery had struck. There was a brief exchange of fire between the M113 gunner and the main battle tank, which effectively fired its 12.7 millimeter machine gun at it, as it didn't even waste any of its shells on this vehicle because the 50 cal on this vehicle could literally do nothing to the Type 96B main battle tank. Although it was a threat to its gunner, the artillery came in before anything could really occur. It was a very short-lived firefight as this platoon effectively broke up, deploying two tanks in two different directions, along with the accompanying squad of armored infantry troops taking position in this mansion, as this area had been hit with not only the AFT-10 strikes from the HJ-10 missiles coming from the two platoons from the anti-tank company, which was effectively the fire support company of the armored infantry, but also loitering munition strikes had come in and destroyed these vehicles and personnel. Again, it was not uncommon for multiple different systems to hit the same target, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system effectively guided many different systems to attack different forces, and many of them with different systems all at the same time. Again, with the streamlining of combat data, firepower was economized and maximized to the fullest extent while also minimizing friendly fire casualties. As armed reactionary civilians fled across this walking park from other homes, this home, as they took shelter in it, as they were seen doing so, would be struck by 155 and 152 millimeter fire, as would these homes be destroyed as well. And this one horribly gutted, and this one as well, as they were relatively well spread out, but they would all be pummeled by artillery strikes. This whole area was condemned to destruction because the American Bradley IFV had retreated through this area as the main battle tanks were moving up the street, and these forces had been hit by HJ-10s as they emerged from the building, and the tank had come around. And although the smoking hulk of metal was somewhat in the way of this Bradley as this tank took position between these homes, the tank started to maneuver itself into place where it could hit the Bradley, and the Bradley hurriedly got out of the area, but loitering munitions and artillery came in at roughly the same time and annihilated not only the Bradley, but the remnants survivors of its squad that had not been hit by HJ-10s or loitering munition strikes, as this was a squad originally from this vehicle, and also some from the Bradley. As they had retreated out of the area, the artillery had completely flattened these homes and destroyed the vehicle and troops in the process along with it, as well as these armed reactionary civilians who were moving in a sizable number across this walking park. There were more behind them, as heavy weapons were now being sanctioned for use, as the fighting was now becoming more intense, as more and more enemies were making themselves known coming out of these homes. The choice was clear that these forces would have to use and deploy their heaviest weapons against these forces, as these tanks would hold a field of fire controlling this entire area, and this area, along with the troops taking position on the first and second floor of this mansion, they now had fields of fire that controlled this entire sector, while the 3 remaining tanks spaced themselves out and continued moving up the street, stopping with the first tank stopping at the very end and eliminating these 2 armed reactionary civilians hiding around the side of this house, because they were seen by all the quadcopter assets. They knew where everything was. They knew where all these personnel were. These homes were already destroyed from the shell way back from the lead tank destroying this vehicle at the opening of the battle. These homes were completely flattened, and there were nothing left but smoke and small fires. These personnel had emerged from this house, but would be fired at by the lead main battle tank's turret machine gunner and also the coaxial machine gun, before eventually a frag T-shell would be used, fired right behind them in this position, which would destroy them completely as they tried to take cover behind this large mansion. 2 personnel would run across the street, but the turret gunner would swing his 12.7 millimeter machine gun around on the turret and start firing at these personnel, while the coaxial machine gun and main gun were pointing in this direction, and they cut one of them down, but one would escape, but not for long. As that had occurred, loitering munitions had entered this area wherein the headquarters platoon was currently posted, as this whole area was now completely swept clean and completely under PLA control, as PLA troops and a tank, as well as also these squads, and still holding their positions, with the squad having cleared this area. Now, the final push against the headquarters platoon was being prepared. All the while, behind this platoon, it has to be understood that there were armed reactionary civilians in other parts of this neighborhood, that, like the end of the neighborhood where it was separated from the industrial area by a strip of land that had scattered wooded areas and undeveloped lots and small shops here and there. The armed reactionary civilians in this spot right here outside of this front of the house were hit by a loitering munition strike with a heat round. Although heat rounds were not ideal for groups of infantry, it worked on these personnel, but it was ideal to use fragmentation and HE rounds when dealing with clusters of enemy infantry, as the heat round was mostly utilized for penetrating heavily armored vehicles or light bunkers or certain building materials, which was highly effective at, and still, although could cause damage to dismounts, as these personnel were cut down by this squad easily, along with vehicle-based fire and tactical L-vectored fire. This squad bounded ahead as these vehicles were now at this intersection and were preparing to press their final assault, as was this squad that was here at the same time as this squad on either side, tactically, and they bounded into this house while the vehicles now pressed ahead with the squad alongside of them. Personnel now fled this house as the squad entered and were cut down by the squad firing out of windows. This vehicle had retreated, this Max Pro MRAP, but was hit by a loitering munition strike. A loitering munition would come in and annihilate the fuel truck, while the main battle tank, the lead main battle tank, rolled ahead into position, leaving the other 2 here, and fired at these forces, and artillery strikes were called in, as well as also HJ-10 strikes on the remaining dismounted troops who fled from vehicles and tried to fight back in a last-ditch effort, but were destroyed in artillery, HJ-10, loitering munition, and also fire from small arms fire, and from the squad here as well, and fire from the lead IFV shooting its 30mm autocannon, 100mm shell fire, and using one of its 2 HJ-09 ATGMs out of its dual pod. As this battle effectively had wrapped up by now, with the PLA completely in control and having had cleared the American forces out of this large, wealthy, upscale neighborhood, completely annihilating Charlie Company, with very few survivors, which had been taken POW, as the firepower, again, with the use of AI, was totally streamlined and economized to the point where surviving attacks from the PLA was very rare, unless the personnel were fortunate enough to just be horribly wounded and captured, or if they just opted to surrender, which at this point in time was not very common, but it did happen. These forces now were, again, in total control of this neighborhood, having had cleared it successfully. Concurrently occurring with this combat was a more straightforward battle that was unfolding in the industrial site, which was effectively to the north and east of the upscale suburban neighborhood wherein Charlie Company had been taking refuge for the time being, as the American forces were completely under heavy assault from multiple directions. The combat that would unfold in the industrial site would be especially savage and very short lived, as the actual combat itself would be just over 30 minutes in duration, but the movements to get these forces into place would take 30 minutes as well, as they left their positions on the perimeter of the cordon of these forces and effectively moved themselves into position in order to assault these forces, as the same had occurred in the neighborhood wherein the armed reactionary civilians and Charlie Company had been fighting together to try to hold out against these PLA forces in a desperate attempt to resist, although they were soundly crushed and viciously crushed by an entire array of diverse weapons platforms, all working hand in hand and guided through the hand of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, utilizing the gargantuan surveillance apparatus, the ISR capabilities, as its eyes and ears in order to put together the strike packages and guide the units on how to exactly move their forces. One of 4 combat platoons of the anti-tank company within the light mechanized infantry battalion had been deployed with the light mechanized infantry company that was participating in this particular battle within the industrial area to effectively be the infantry support of the tank company that was also committed to battle in this area, leaving its position on the perimeter as the remaining combat troops of both battalions, the light mechanized infantry and armored battalions, spread out to take their place on the perimeter. And now that the perimeter was effectively secured, these forces moved in to conduct their major assault to eradicate these 2 companies, with Delta Company being the company trapped in the industrial site, having had wagons circled their vehicles in a desperate attempt to resist the oncoming onslaught. The company captain here as well decided to go down swinging, just as the company captain had in the nearby embattled, currently, suburban neighborhood, as both battles were happening concurrently. Although the battle in the suburbs lasted just a bit longer, this battle would be, again, relatively short-lived, as these 2 tank platoons moved into position on a high position on a road bridge over the rail network that ran through this area, as this was freight rail. This was a factory with a large concrete platform for offloading and loading goods from the factory, from the supply chain it used before the war broke out, with a large ramp here, same over here. This was a warehouse/office combo building, and these were specifically just warehouse buildings. This was an office. These were all warehouses of various companies, like parcel companies and other companies that needed to utilize these warehouse structures for storing either finished goods or parts of their supply chain, as they would stockpile such items in these different warehouses. This was a large, sprawling industrial park, effectively, with small number of factories, large number of offices and warehouses. And now these American forces were taking refuge within it. And they had wagon circled their 3 combat platoons in the area, but now they were coming under heavy assault from 2 dedicated Wingling 2 combat drones, which were firing the very powerful CM502KG dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-tank missiles at these vehicles, which, if it could penetrate battleship armor, which is why it was a dual-purpose missile, it could easily annihilate any vehicle on the battlefield. And now, also, the spread-out anti-tank platoon from the anti-tank company within within the light mechanized infantry battalion were there in place to support the 3 combat platoons of the light mechanized infantry forces as they moved into the area. as they would contribute some firepower to this operation. There would also be the two other AFT-10 platoons from the AFT-10 company and the Armored Battalion that would also dedicate firepower to this operation as well, in the form of their HJ-10s, which again were very long-ranged ATGMs with a max range of 6.2 miles, and they could be fired at an arc and over a relatively long range. As two of 4 combat platoons of the AFT-10s were on standby for this combat operation, they would support the armor and the light mechanized infantry forces in this battle as they moved in. As the factories and offices and warehouses were being cleared by the light mechanized infantry in this particular part of the battle space, they were guided into these positions by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system in order to establish proper fields of fire to cover this entire area, while the armor that was on this high elevation for the area, as this bridge was elevated, could traverse their main guns at a 10-degree slope facing downward and could cover a large area. As again, this was a 1 mile north-south area by a 1.5 mile east-to-west area, and if the tanks could get on a higher area, they could have fields of fire that covered this massive area of the battlefield, minus where there were exceedingly higher buildings, such as this factory here and some of the warehouse buildings. But for the most part, their fields of fire would encompass a very large area from atop this higher ground, as they again could slope their main guns at a 10-degree angle. And as this was again a mile, they could easily hit targets that were in this particular area where the company captain had tried to wagon circle his forces. As the rail embankments were being attempted to be used as fighting positions as they were elevated and the troops could lay down in the prone behind them and tried to take cover behind them, troops filled sandbags with gravel and whatever earth they could find to fill these sandbags with outside of this building, as the time was running out, as PLA forces had closed the noose around these forces. Their reconnaissance squads, or their scouting parties, 1 squad from each platoon. This squad came from the headquarters platoon. They were running out of this area frantically, as they had originally tried to return to warn of PLA forces being spotted, but now that the loitering munitions had been launched and the quadcopter assets had mapped the area in real time, these forces were annihilated by 2 heat warhead-equipped CH-901As, while the rest would be mostly using their AI target-seeking mode against the vehicle-based targets, as they were equipped with heat warheads, and the AI target-seeking mode was effectively high prioritizing the vehicles over the ground troops, although again, the ground troops were not completely excluded from being targeted, as these were the closest munitions and range that could destroy these forces. They utilized them against these forces through the AI target-seeking mode. And also, as these vehicles now moved into place over the bridge, this platoon would move into place under it to clear these forces, as their quadcopter assets had just discovered them underneath the bridge, with the loitering munitions loitering over the battlefield looking for targets. The main battle tanks would utilize their coax machine guns and their turret-based machine guns to cut these forces down. Although they tried to return fire desperately, they were completely annihilated. Due to the horrible supply situation in the Army at this time, especially in the National Guard, due to the USA pissing away vast majorities of its ammunition, which was vital to fighting wars, including anti-tank guided missiles to 2 different proxy conflicts, one in Europe and one in the Middle East, there were very few ATGMs left in the U.S. Army, with the active duty component getting the highest priority for ATGMs, with the National Guard getting the lowest priority. Only their Bradley IFVs had 2 tow missiles in their pods, and also each combat platoon only had 1 Javelin ATGM, as again, America produced very little ATGMs, and most of their large, considerable stocks had been sent overseas and were now pissed away. There was really not very much left. And again, the National Guard got the lowest priority, as did reserves for these types of weapons. And these forces, although they were combat forces from the National Guard, were ill-prepared to deal with the type of firepower they would be facing, as this company came in with 2 platoons advancing into position, one moving south, the other moving south, destroying these 2 vehicles with heat shells, both being M113s, wounding or causing KIAs to some of the troops that were immediately behind this one being destroyed, as these vehicles frantically now tried to break out in a panic as they saw tanks moving down the street. They now were being destroyed by tank shell fire as these tanks then turned to destroy these forces hiding under the bridge. These were, again, the other scouting parties, one from each combat platoon, with the rest of the squads all dismounted, trying to fight back against the armored infantry, who rolled in firing their potent 35mm Gatling autocannon at this M113, shredding it to absolute and total pieces, as well as these troops, as this system was exceedingly powerful. Plus, they also had on each side of their turret a rail system with a short-range HJ-73C ATGM, which could give them a defense against main battle tanks or other vehicles like IFVs, like the Bradley, for instance. But in this instance, the 35mm Gatling autocannon was more than enough to shred up all of these vehicles, including a Bradley, but the Bradley was a high-priority target due to its tow missiles and was targeted immediately by the Wingloom 2s, as well as also loitering munitions and, of course, HJ-10 strikes coming in from the AFT-10s. It was desired to eliminate these vehicles before they even had an opportunity to fire at the main battle tanks with their tow missiles, and this worked, and it worked exceedingly well. Even the main battle tanks took out Bradleys right away as they came down the street. They destroyed this Bradley with a CM502KG, as well as also loitering munition strikes, all hitting at roughly about the same time, leaving vehicles looking much like this, where there was little to nothing left, as the troops also were shredded and in pieces, many missing limbs and laying bleeding in piles in the streets and in the parking lots. They were blown to pieces by a wide array of different munition types, from 125mm main gun tank shells of different types to ATGMs fired from the Wingloom 2 dedicated combat drones, as well as also the loitering munition strikes, which are absolutely devastating against these vehicles and even personnel hiding inside of the office/warehouse combo. If there were muzzle flashes seen fired out the window, these loitering munitions would crash into the wall and destroy the personnel inside, or even fly into the window itself and blast the personnel, as these two squads would take refuge in these two warehouses and try to fire out of doors of the warehouse buildings as this tank column, this one platoon, moved into place and broke into a herringbone formation to cover the back and sides. The two tanks following the lead tank, which would move here, would fire shells into these warehouse buildings, basically gradually blasting these buildings to absolute and total ruination with very powerful HE or heat shells from these main battle tanks, as well as also frag T shells. And the lead tank was now firing at this vehicle, which was destroyed, this M113, and then continuing to fire at this building as there were personnel trying to fire out at it with everything from AT-4s to 240 Bravos, which were not adequate for use against most vehicles, but they were fighting with everything they had, or M249 saws, and of course their rifles, and some of the rifles had 40mm grenades, which were also fired at these forces, doing absolutely nothing to them, but these forces were gradually being ripped to pieces, and HJ-10 strikes were coming in, hitting vehicles. As this vehicle tried to come around the building, this M113, it was hit by the tank that had been firing at this building, quickly turning its turret, traversing it to fire at this vehicle and blasting it to pieces as there was another building right here. It was trying to come between them. The HJ-10 strikes came in and destroyed these vehicles. These troops tried to flee also with the vehicle. As the vehicle had been destroyed, they were also then fired at quickly as the tank crew acted fast by a frag T shell, which blasted them to pieces as well. As these tanks continued then to fire at these buildings, HJ-10 strikes came in to hit the tops of the buildings, as also artillery missions were being prepared at this time. As this squad was destroyed by a combination of loitering munition strike as well as HJ-10 strikes, this squad had hurriedly tried to evacuate the area, but was being fired at by the turret gunners on these main battle tanks that had split up and had their weapons oriented in different directions to cover different areas, and the turret machine gunners were firing at these troops with their 12.7mm fire. One soldier was horribly maimed, but he was carried to safety behind this concrete ramp here with the loading and offloading ramp, while the rest of the squad tried to move ahead. Another squad member tried to provide aid, but they ran into danger as this column from one platoon of light mechanized infantry had rolled into the warehouse parking area outside of these warehouses and this factory, and had laid down enormous 35 millimeter autocannon fire, which left nothing left of these squad members. And also, they would eventually have their wounded captured along with the personnel that was giving aid. They decided not to waste any heavy munitions against those personnel. But in this instance, the ATGMs had been fired from this anti-tank weapon, this WZ-550, from the anti-tank company, from the platoon deployed with this light mechanized infantry company. They were fired at this M113 at the same time as 30 millimeter autocannon fire was used, and also 12.7 millimeter fire from the follow-up vehicle. The APC version of the ZBL-08 was utilized with their 12.7 millimeter fire, cutting into this squad as they tried to come around the corner and fight with even a few AT-4s that they had, as AT-4s were now highly relied upon since there were effectively very few ATGMs remaining. This was effectively their next best option of a weapon with which to combat more heavily armored targets. This was a recoilless shell, which was 84 millimeters, but once used, the tube was disposable. But they had somewhat decent stocks of these compared to their exceedingly small stocks of ATGMs. And these AT-4s could cause some serious damage or even destruction on certain vehicle types, but effectively the combat was so savage, the firepower advantage so extreme, that these forces really had no chance to even use these weapons, minus a very few instances. Like one shot would get off and badly damage the APC version of a ZBL-08 in this particular platoon, but the firepower vectored against these forces all at once, 35 millimeter fire, even one of the two from the IFV in this platoon, one of the two HJ-73Cs would be fired at this Bradley at the same time as CM502 KGs came in, hit this M113 and this Bradley trying to race out of this area. This squad was attacked heavily by heavy machine gun fire from 12.7 millimeter fire and 35 millimeter Gatling autocannon fire. This ATGM vehicle, this WZ-550 from the anti-tank platoon deployed with this company of light mech infantry, would fire its HJ-09s at these vehicles at the same time. CM502 KGs, 35 millimeter auto fire, and even one of the two from this platoon's IFV, HJ-73Cs at the Bradley. All of this firepower coming in was simply immense and shredded these personnel and vehicles to absolute scrap. As these vehicles, this M113 and the squad came around to engage the tanks, they were destroyed by frag T shells and a standard heat shell into the M113, which annihilated it, as well as also loitering munition strikes as well. All of this firepower was simply gargantuan, and eventually artillery was called in within 15 minutes of the battle beginning, and 5 minutes later, as the pre-prepared strike package made it to the FDC from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, an entire slew of 152 millimeter and 155 millimeter shells came in from the PLL-66 batteries on standby and the PLL-01 batteries that were on standby. As these howitzers let loose a torrent of absolute and total annihilation, which completely and totally crushed all the remnants of this company, including the company commander, the captain, who was holed up in this building, which was also being hit by tank shells by this time, as well as also strikes from HJ-10s, which were also hitting these warehouses. But as this came in, all of this destruction simply annihilated these personnel that were even clinging to life, some hiding behind their sandbag emplacements, attempting to put up a fight, but they just simply couldn't resist the vectoring of fire from the tanks that were on the bridge firing into them at this time, at the same time as the artillery came in, as well as HJ-10 strikes, loitering munition strikes, and as these strikes had already occurred earlier with the CM502 KGs destroying the fuel truck, the armored recovery vehicle, and also the Bradley and an APC, all of this destruction was simply immense, as there were a few survivors in these two warehouse buildings that were further back from where the tank shells had impacted and basically gutted and razed the front of these buildings to the ground. They would come out and surrender to the PLA armor that was in this area, and the light mechanized infantry troops would eventually move into the area to effectively zip tie these personnel and take them as POWs, as well as also capturing the wounded man that was mortally wounded almost, as well as the caretaker, the soldier providing emergency aid that were hiding behind this concrete ramp, as they would already had bounded and covered tactically and cleared these buildings as they moved in, as this platoon was completely dismounted from their platoon vehicles, and the rolling T's watching the tops of the buildings and the front entrances had moved in, with the squad staying outside as per procedure. The squad also taking a corner, staying outside as per procedure. These vehicles moving into place here, and these two squads taking this building, now having fields of fire covering a wide area of the battlefield. Again, the tanks could survey a massive area as these two platoons had their weapons staggered to watch multiple directions, multiple fields of fire, as well as also the tanks on the bottom having cleared these areas and watched this area and also under the bridge. And these infantry troops in the buildings and also their vehicles having a wide field of fire to cover this area. They were now in complete control and would again sweep the area post artillery barrage to look for any survivors, if it was even possible, to take prisoner and give them proper medical care. In the next video of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines, the fighting having had concluded to capture the DFW International Airport would effectively lead into PLA armored forces from the original 3 attacking battalions conducting a logistical resupply operation to effectively maintain their vehicles and effectively top off all supplies, including ammunition, fuel, and more, and conduct needed maintenance, etc. And as these battalions would allow the 2 air assault battalions to effectively consolidate control over the recently captured international airport and hold on to it, the 3 armored battalions would strike against the remnants of the 3rd of the 144th, having been heavily bombarded by everything from PHLO-3 300mm MLR systems for hours, as well as also the 155mm PLL-01 battalion here in this grouping of artillery forces from the 19th Artillery Brigade, and a PLL-66 battalion, all of which heavily shelling the Irving area and the area immediately south of the International Airport, wherein the 3rd of the 144th, an American mechanized infantry force of the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, had its different companies divvied up. There are also thousands of armed reactionary civilians having had emerged in this area, and a hotly contested, almost a Battle of Berlin type situation from 1945 would occur in this portion of this gargantuan urban area, as block by block, street by street, rubble pile by rubble pile, building husk to building husk, this area would be fought over by not only the 3 armored battalions having had assisted in the capture and clearance of the international airport, but 2 mechanized infantry battalions from the 16th Infantry Division, as effectively the air power would also be immense, as heavy strategic bombing was occurring in this area from both the H-20 stealth strategic bomber aircraft, which were enormously powerful, as well as also the potent and vaunted H-6Ks as well, with their electronic warfare capabilities to boot. These aircraft, having had flattened much of the city, would also contribute slightly in this particular portion of the battle as well, namely the H-20s, as these aircraft were still hitting targets even in this late time, kept in the air by the refueling aircraft such as the Chinese YU or YY-20s, as well as also the Russian IL-76s, which kept these aircraft in the air. I'm sorry, IL-78s. This battle was still far from over, as the central portion of the Metroplex had to be cleared, and also the following on the second day would be a major battle in the national grasslands, as the remnants of any and all major resistance in the city would be hunted down viciously by PLA and PLAAF forces and even the strategic missile forces in this particular battle that was to occur on day 2, as this key node was to be cleared according to 4th generation warfare doctrines to allow for the external components to pass through it seamlessly and easily. This
would come as a major achievement toward the goals and objectives of the overall invasion, allowing for these external invasion components, as the Trojans will have done their task of controlling this node, to pass through to the heartland of America to act as the heavy-handed reinforcements deep inland for the Trojans that are there and fighting at the moment, and would bring this invasion to a close, seeing the vast majority of the entire 12.5 million man forces in total complete control of the nation. Although tertiary areas would still have to be cleared, all that composes a nation will have been secured by day 4, and most of it mopped up, except for tertiary areas wherein the armed reactionary or non-reactionary civilians rather will have been trying to regroup and begin the insurgency, which would last for years. Although the United States would be militarily and politically defeated and cease to be a sovereign nation, the people would continue the fight. More to come in the next video in the hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines through a Sino-Russian coalition invasion.